And the character Ken played is a lot like his journey, if you want to talk to him about his spiritual journey over the years. And it's investigation to what the Bible has to say, what does Jesus claim, what's it all really about. In fact, we're going to look at that together because I think all of us have wondered at one point or another, is the Bible really true? We've heard someone come along and say, isn't the Bible filled with contradictions? You can't take it literally. There's maybe some allegories there, like Aesop's fables or some nice ideas, but let's not take it too far. So that's the question we want to ask. Is the Bible filled with contradictions? Christopher Hitchens died this last year. He wrote a book called God is Not Great. And he affirmed that the Bible, God, religion, it's all filled with contradictions. Even at the end, he defiantly said that he knew for sure that the Bible wasn't reliable and neither was God. He said in his cursory reading of the Bible, every chapter disagreed on every major doctrine and every major issue, and he just couldn't believe it. And he'd encourage us not to. He said the only reason people believed the Bible was true is because for years, if you voiced a concern, you'd be burned at the stake to silence you. And that with deductive reasoning, science, and philosophy, and a more enlightened way of thinking, no intelligent person could believe that the Bible was actually reliable. I think a lot of us have struggled with that or wondered that. In fact, I heard a story about a man and a woman, Joy and Glenn. They owned a bookstore. A guy came in, a skeptic, he came in, and he said, hey, I'm looking for a book about Bible contradictions. Joy said, I've got a great one here by Dr. DeHaan. It's called 508 Seemingly Contradictions in the Bible. The skeptic scornfully said, seemingly contradictions? What do you mean by that? So, well, Dr. Hahn thought the Bible was believable, that you should take it literal, and that it was historical, and many of the seemingly contradictions can be explained in the right context. The skeptic said, well, I might read that. It might be amusing. Glenn walked in from the back and said, well, are you a student of the Bible? The skeptic said, hardly. Glenn said, really? Because any serious student of the Bible who studied it for years could point out a lot of seemingly contradictions of the Bible. I could point out some that would make your head spin. And yet I believe the Bible is historical and true. This caught the skeptic by surprise. He says, what do you mean? And Glenn said, well, have you ever systematically studied through the Bible for any period of time? No, I don't believe in it. He said, well, that's interesting. Can you think of any other field of study in philosophy, science, archaeology, medicine, where somebody would never have studied the subject and yet conclusively knew for sure that it was wrong and full of contradictions? Now, isn't that worth considering? Because I think many of us have these ideas about the Bible that we're carrying with us because of emotions from the past, like we saw in the drama, like things we read somewhere, but we've never done the hard work of investigating the stories and the facts on our own. I went to lunch recently with a guy who's been attending Horizon for a couple years. He said, you know, I grew up religious, and yet I would say I didn't know a lot about the Bible. Stories about Jesus or Moses maybe here or there, but a couple years ago I began to investigate. I picked up a book by an atheist turned Christian who investigated the facts. It was called The Case for Christ. Then I read another book called The Case for Faith. And as I read through these books, I was looking at the facts. Is the Bible really reliable? I wanted to look into it myself. And that's what I want to encourage us to do this morning, is this. We want to investigate the factual predictions, not the rumored contradictions. Many of us have heard about the rumored contradictions, and I'd encourage you to look into that today. But what we're going to do as a group is we're going to investigate the factual predictions the Bible makes. Because if the Bible's true, and if what God said is true, there should be evidence outside the Bible to substantiate the claims. So we're going to investigate the factual predictions made by the Bible as we go through Fast Track today. So if you have your pen with you, and if you have a marker with you, we're going to start in the top left as we have before, as we go through the rest of the Old Testament in one swoosh here. We ended last week with Solomon, King Solomon. Well, just as Solomon's reign is about to come to an end, God makes a prediction. And the prediction is that his kingdom would be divided into the north and the south. And these two kingdoms, God's very specific about this prediction. He says that Solomon's son would end up ruling over one tribe to the south, which will end up being Judah, and the other tribes will move to the north, which is Israel. Well, again, Solomon had a pretty substantiated kingdom. The idea that it would be divided was pretty radical that somebody would predict this. The fact that the details of the prediction would be that most of the tribes would go to the north and that he would primarily rule over one tribe was a pretty radical tradition. It was a pretty radical prediction. Yet history records that Rehoboam comes to power. As he comes to power, the people all come to him and say, hey, we want to serve you. We want to be with you. But your dad got out of control. I mean, God warned us about centrally controlled monarchy governments back in 1 Samuel, but your dad took it to a new extreme. He's taxing us to death. He's spent us to death. Please lighten the load, they say, and we will serve you. Well, Rehoboam has a decision to make. He's got all kinds of dreams and hopes that his dad passed on to him, and he'd like to continue, but he needs to tax the people to do it. So he turns to the old guard, his cabinet members who'd been with his dad. He said, guys, what should we do? And his old guard said, the people are right. You know what? We served your dad. We loved your dad. But he just became tyrannical at the end. He started coercing everybody. Lighten the load. Let the people choose to serve you. Give them back their rights. Rehoboam turns to the younger group, his guys he hired on board, and said, what do you think? They said, you tell people that you're going to be as strong as ever, and they can't push you around. You need to up the ante, not lower it. So Rehoboam calls everybody together in this critical moment in Israel's history, a moment that they could stay unified and together or not. And he says this powerful speech. He gathers them together. They're coming hoping he's going to serve them, hoping he's going to love them. And he says, my little finger is thicker than my father's thigh. He beats you with whips, and I will whip you with scorpions. And he goes on and on. He does not lighten the load. He does not lighten the taxation. He does not reinstill their liberty. And instead, just as God predicted, rips the kingdom. The 10 primary tribes go to the north with Israel. One primary tribe goes to the south with Judah. And one almost gets eliminated, the tribe of Benjamin. Just as God predicted, the kingdom gets ripped in half. And now we have two different parts that will move to the next part of history. The northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah. Well, the northern kingdom, Israel, God makes another prediction. Let me tell you what that prediction is. He says, I will protect you. I will watch over you. I will forgive you. Just keep coming back to me for leadership. Keep coming back to me for forgiveness. Well, the northern kingdom listens to his prediction for a little bit. God says, but if you don't want my protection, and if you don't seek me for forgiveness and leadership, there is a lot of hurt coming your way. In fact, there is a nation called the Assyrians. And they may seem small now, but they are expanding their influence. And they're going to come in and they're going to crush you. So trust me so that doesn't happen. But they don't trust him. And the Assyrians do come in. And they take over the Israelites just as God predicted. And they are ruthless. As they take children, relatives, friends, torture people in their homes, drag people behind chariots, just ruthless, ruthless empire. And the capital city of the Assyrian Empire is a place called Nineveh. And God makes another radical prediction after they've conquered the northern empire. He says, I predict that this evil, wicked, horrific nation, given an opportunity, would ask for my forgiveness and my leadership. What? There is no way that any kingdom like that would want your forgiveness and leadership. God says, I got a prediction that they will. So he calls a prophet named Jonah. He says, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh and tell them that they need to change their ways, find my forgiveness, and find my leadership. Jonah says, no way. The Assyrians, the Ninevites, the people who hurt my family, the people who took away my relatives and my neighbors, I don't want you forgiving them. Those are my enemies. I'm out of here. And he runs to the far side. He gets on a boat and goes the opposite direction. The sailors grab him and they throw him overboard when a storm hits. And now this disobedient religious prophet who's rebelling against God gets captured. He gets captured. And a great fish. He's swallowed by the great fish, and God turns him around and heads him back toward the Assyrian Empire. Some wonder, well, how did he survive in the belly of a fish? Some don't think he does. In fact, in chapter 2, he talks about the fact that God delivered him from Sheol, possibly that he died in that great fish, and God raised him from the dead. Jesus will later reference this. Just as Jonah was in the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so too I will be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. But however it is, God turns him around, brings him back to the Assyrian Empire, and says, I want you to come to the Assyrians and to Nineveh and tell them, I forgive them. But Jonah still hates them. Jonah doesn't want God to forgive them. So he goes through town delivering the worst possible turn or burn sermon you can imagine. He's hoping the people won't respond. But they do. They hear him and they say, oh man, we are off base. We are off track. We need God's forgiveness. What were we thinking? And instead of Jonah putting this on his resume, multi-million person city responds to my message. Do you want me to do it too? No, we find him walking up on a hillside, looking down at the city, pouting. And now he wants to commit suicide. What? In his words, he says, oh God, I would rather be dead than live in a world with forgiven Assyrians. I would rather be dead than live in a world where you forgive my enemies. And here he tells us why he ran away to begin with. He said, God, this is exactly why I ran away. You are too kind, and you are too nice, and you are too merciful, and you give too many chances. This is the God of the Old Testament. Loving his enemies, forgiving his enemies. And God gives this beautiful, tender speech. You can almost see God getting down on one knee as he turns to Jonah. He says, Jonah, should I not care about those I've made? Every man, woman, and child in Nineveh. I even care about their livestock because I made them and I love them and I want them to return. And just as God predicted, the empire of the Ninevites returned to him. And the story of Jonah, the account of Jonah, reminds us that God has come to rescue religious people who think they're better than other people. They need God's forgiveness. And rebellious people who think they know better than God by doing wickedness need his forgiveness. You see, the message of the Bible is that God comes to rescue us from our good works and our bad works. He comes to rescue moral people and immoral people, religious people and irreligious people. And he does it through these predictions. The third prediction he makes is what happens to the southern kingdom. If the northern kingdom gets conquered by the Assyrians, what happens to the southern kingdom? Well, the southern kingdom goes on a roller coaster ride because they have kings that take them up and kings that take them down. They have good kings and they have bad kings. And one moment they'll be trusting God, the next moment they'll be disobeying. But there are enough good kings that God continues to wait and long and hope that they will return to him. Two kings that lead the people up to a place of relying on God are two J's. Jehoshaphat and Josiah. They say, let's rely on God. Let's trust God. And they lead people back to their own fast-track Bible. They begin to pass out versions of the Bible so people can begin to read them and understand them and know what's right, know what's wrong, and know how to find forgiveness. But God makes a prediction during this time of the southern kingdom. He says, you guys have been on this roller coaster ride, and I want to let you know. If you'll trust me, I'll protect you. But if you don't trust me, there is a kingdom called the Babylonian kingdom, and they're going to come in, and they're going to hurt you. And I don't want that, so trust me. But Judah doesn't trust him. And they don't find him reliable. And they say, well, you know, the best way for us to not get conquered, we are going to make a treaty with the Assyrians who conquered the northern kingdom. Well, like most of world history, when you make a treaty, you end up getting the enemies of the people who attack the person you make a treaty with. The Babylonians decide to attack the Assyrians. Because the Assyrians have a treaty with the southern kingdom, Babylon comes after them too. And sure enough, history records, just as God predicted, the Babylonians come along and conquered the southern kingdom. And now, in God's incredible brilliance, he has found a way to put the pieces back together again. Because now the northern kingdom and southern kingdom are united together as they were captured by the Babylonians. And God predicts that this will last for 70 years. And after 70 years, he'll let them loose. It's a pretty specific prediction. The Babylonians, 70 years. During that time, Ezekiel and Daniel, two prophets, come on the scene and say, all right, we messed up. God did exactly what he said he would do, but he's got something good in store. He says if we will follow him, if we will trust him, if we'll seek him for forgiveness, he will restore us in 70 years. Well, Daniel was a teenager at the time. when he got transported to Babylon, they took all of the leaders, all of the men and women with the most potential, and transported them to Babylon. And while they were there, Daniel has a dream. So he's living in Babylon. So let's draw a Babylon here together. Here's my Babylon. And as Daniel's living in Babylon, he has a dream, a vision. And in this vision, if you have never studied this, and if you've ever wondered if the Bible is true, here's where I might start. God will predict accurately the next 600 years of world history. In other words, we can date this book. In the next 600 years, the predictions God makes will come true in history. He predicts that Babylon will rule. He predicts that Babylon will be conquered by the Medes and the Persians. He predicts that a king of Greece will come to power. And again, saying that Greece would come to power would be like me standing here today and saying, one day the nation of Chad will take over the United States. It was just laughable to think that Greece would ever be a world power, and that there would be a king, Alexander the Great, that would conquer the Medes and Persians, and that his kingdom would be divided into 4 parts, which history tells us that when Alexander the Great died, his 4 generals took over exactly as God predicted, and that they would be conquered by the Romans. And during the time of the Romans, there would be a rock, not made from human hands, something that came not from the earth, that would come into the world during the Roman Empire, and it would start a kingdom that would turn the world upside down and grow into a giant mountain. And sure enough, you know what history shows? If you take the Bible in this hand and you got your history book in another hand, you will find out that the Medes and the Persians took over the Babylonians, the Greeks conquered the Medes and Persians, Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided into 4 sections, and sure enough, the Romans came on the scene. It was during the time of Romans that Jesus Christ was born and came into the world and started a kingdom that resulted in you and I here in Cincinnati, 2,000 plus years later, still talking about this kingdom that's growing and expanding throughout the world. Now, I am not saying faith is the opposite of evidence, am I? Faith is putting your belief in the evidence. And if you've never studied the evidence, what are you going to put your faith in? So what I'm encouraging you to do is say, is that really true? Chad just made some radical statements. I need to look into that. Did God really predict that? Did that really happen? Did that really come true? Because if it did, this is a lot more than just belief for belief's sake. This is belief in the evidence. Well, it's during this time that God makes a prediction. He says, during the Babylonian Empire, I want you to know I'm going to rescue you. I'm going to send my people back. I can rescue my people out of this Babylonian time period. But I'll give you some object lessons to make sure that you can trust me. So the first one is during this time. Now, Daniel is about 80 years old when this happens. And 80 years old, as a leader to dignitaries and kings, he has a lot of political enemies that make a law that say if you pray privately and somebody finds out about it, that you'll be thrown to a lion's den or into a giant sunflower, depending on what you think that picture looks like. So Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and his king, his friend, is so thrilled to find out that God supernaturally delivered him from the lions. Another story in the book, or account of the book, is where God delivers Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from a fiery furnace. And God is giving these tangible examples of his supernatural ability to rescue people so that everyone could have a promise and hope that 70 years from now, God would do exactly what he said he would do, which is rescue the entire people. And that's exactly what happens. But they're still waiting for the 70 years to come down. They're still waiting for the end of that time period. Well, 70 years are now up. At the end of the 70 years, the king of Babylon is having a party. And it is a party to end all parties. This is a drunken brawl of a party. In fact, he uses all of the instruments, the holy instruments from the temple he stole from the northern and southern kingdom to have this party. And in the middle of the party, the king writes and says that all of a sudden a giant hand appeared to him and to all those present and wrote on the wall of his banquet. In fact, the phrase, the writing on the wall, or hey, the handwriting's on the wall, it comes from this passage in Daniel, where this hand of God appeared and wrote, Min tekel upharsin, which means your kingdom, your works, your deeds have been weighed in the court of heaven, and you have come up wanting. And and your kingdom will be divided from you. It will be taken from you this very night. This was laughable prediction. The idea that the Babylonians would lose their world power status is just laughable. They were too powerful. They were too mighty. When they built their capital city, the walls were so thick no one had ever penetrated them. They have 1 year's supply of food so no one could starve them out. They built their city on top of a river so they had a constant water supply for washing, for cleaning, for providing for their crops. Yet God said that the Persians would conquer them that very night. But here's what history records. A few months earlier, many months earlier, the Medes and Persians were going to conquer them. So they took that river that ran through their city and they began to divert it a few miles away. And they diverted the river just enough that they got the water level to go down. The water level went down enough, and the Babylonians didn't realize it, that very night, history records that the Medes and Persians sent their entire garrison of soldiers through the water supply, and they came up inside the city, and everyone was so drunk and so passed out, they conquered the Babylonians in one night through the underwater supply, just as God predicted with the hand. Mean, tekel upharsin. God makes a prediction. History records that it was fulfilled. Well, now the 70 years are up. Just as God predicted, the Medes and Persians are now in control. And they don't have any problem per se with the Israelites or the tribe of Judah. They're just collateral damage. Well, God predicts that they will be able to return to the land. And sure enough, one of the kings of Persia is known for his viciousness. He throws out his wife Vashti, and he throws a beauty contest, of which Esther, Queen Esther, ends up winning the contest. She wins the contest, but nobody knows that she's Jewish. There's a man living in the kingdom named Haman, and Haman goes to town one day, and Mordecai refuses, he's Jewish, refuses to bow down to him. So Haman decides to kill off all the Jewish people. The book of Esther never mentions God's name once. And yet you see God seeing a danger in advance and preparing for it on every page. Haman is putting his plan in place. He's just about to destroy all the Jewish people. He gets the king to sign an edict saying it's okay to kill off all the Jewish people. Mordecai comes to Esther, his relative. He says, Esther, perhaps you have become queen for such a time as this. Perhaps God saw this coming. Perhaps God knew this was coming, and he put you in the right place at the right moment, at the right time, for you to stand up and to tell him that you're Jewish and to tell him that you need to rescue the people. And Esther boldly and courageously speaks up to her husband, the same husband who had knocked out the last wife for speaking up. And he loved her, and his heart was for her. And the king had Haman killed on his own gallows, and he told the Jewish people that they could be rescued and they could fight back if they were attacked. And the Jewish festival of Purim, that many Jewish people celebrate even today, is the recognition of what happened in this moment where God accurately saw a predicted danger in advance and put the solution in place even before anyone saw the danger and brought it to fruition. So that is the book of Esther. Again, we're still living during a time of Persia, but there's no return yet. When are the people going to return? Well, again, this prediction had been made that the people would return to their homeland. Well, there's a man who's been thinking about this. He's a wine taster for the king of Persia. His name is Nehemiah. In fact, if you want to remember him, you can draw it like this. Here he is. Nehemiah. Nehemiah knew that God had predicted that the people could return. He said, well, maybe I could be the one that's part of that plan or part of that prediction. I want to trust God. So he designs a vision. He works on the fundraising. He works on the supply list. He comes to the king and says, hey, king, I know you conquered my land. Would you help me? Would you fund me? Would you provide me security to go back and rebuild the walls of the city that you conquered? Laughable, right? And yet the king says, Nehemiah, that sounds good. I'll do that. He provides the leadership, the security, and the supply list. And Nehemiah goes back to the city. It has now been, these walls that surround the city that offer its protection have been decimated for over 150 years. No one's been able to rebuild the walls for 150 years. And this brilliant leader, this brilliant strategic planner, has a level of quality control that most of us would die for in our companies. He says, how can I make sure the city is built well? He has each family build the portion of wall in front of where they live. Because he knows that if they're building the wall in front of where they live, they're going to build it right. And he is able to rebuild the walls and bring the people through Ezra back into play, just as God predicted, in 52 days. What they had not been able to accomplish in 150 years, Nehemiah accomplished with his leadership and his cooperation with God's work in 52 days, fulfilling the prediction that the people would return to the land years after Babylon when the Persians took over. Now, those are the major movements and the major kingdoms of the Old Testament. Now, the only thing that's happening during this time is that there's a whole bunch of prophets that are speaking to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. They're speaking during the time of Persia and during the time of Babylon. And during this time, they are giving a checklist. And this is an intricate, detailed checklist. They said, you think these predictions God made are true? I've got some predictions about the most important thing, the final forgiver, the Messiah, the sent one, the one that will tell us how to get right with God. The ultimate Passover, the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate king, the ultimate prophet, the ultimate judge is coming. And not like a fortune cookie, think something might happen to you today. Something happened to me today. It gives a detailed list of what to look for, so you'll know him when you see him. It says that he will be born in Bethlehem, the prophet Micah tells us. And yet he will come out of Egypt. And yet he will be called a Nazarene. Well, which is it? It says that he will die on a tree. Hundreds of years this was written before the Romans have even invented crucifixion. It says his bones will not be broken. And yet the Romans always broke the bones of a crucifixion victim because that's how you knew he was dead. It says that his clothes will be divided. It said that he will be betrayed specifically for 30 pieces of silver. How do you predict inflation 400 years in advance? It says he will die. And more than that, the most radical prediction is that he will die and raise himself from the dead. He will say things on the cross like, my God, why have you forsaken me? But God will not let his Holy One see corruption. If you were living during the 400 years before Christ and you saw this checklist, you would say, this is filled with contradictions. No one person could ever be born in Bethlehem, but also be a Galilean, also be a Nazarene, and also come out of Egypt. Which is it? Is he going to die in a tree, or is he going to be resurrected? Is he going to be a mighty warrior, or is he going to be somebody who dies in a suffering servant? It just looked like pure contradiction. And yet 400 years later, when Jesus steps on the scene, history records, historians like Josephus confirm, that Jesus fulfills every single one of these. Every T is crossed and every I is dotted. Now maybe that sounds too good to be true. Maybe that sounds ridiculous. Maybe it's all new information. I don't know where you're at. But here's the key takeaway for all of us. I want to encourage you to explore the factual predictions of the Bible. Explore the rumored contradictions too. Find your hardest one. But don't let some college professor somewhere, or some bad memory of some bad priest or pastor somewhere, or some Reader's Digest article you read, don't let that be the hurdle for your faith. Investigate the factual predictions yourself. Check into it yourself. Now, if you're a follower of Christ, you might say, well, I'm glad you said that, Chad, that you believe the Bible's true, and Horizon believes the Bible's true, because I believe that too. Most people who are followers of Christ might say that they think the Bible's reliable, but honestly, we don't live like it every day. If God can take care of 600 years of human history and know in advance what's happening, can't he take care of the details of your life? Why do you worry so much? Why am you and I such control freaks? Why do we feel like if we don't get ours, nobody else is watching out for us? You see, when you investigate these factual predictions, it changes your daily living. Because you say, if the book's reliable, maybe the author's reliable. And if the author's reliable, I want to trust him with the details of my life. And I want to trust him with the details of my eternity. Investigate the factual predictions. We read the story of Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace was a statesman. He was a lawyer. He was a governor. He was in charge of the territory of New Mexico in 1880. And he began to write a book about New Testament life, or first century life. So he read the New Testament to see if it was even remotely reliable, and he went into it as a skeptic, not sure if he'd believe any of it. But as he began to cross-reference the geography, the evidence, all the facts related to this piece, he was struck. He was struck that the things he was reading in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we'll look at next week, the Gospels, seemed to be substantiated by the evidence available to him. And he was putting together a novel, and he wanted his novel to be as historically accurate as possible. And he was surprised that the details of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lined up with history. It lined up with geography. It lined up with archaeology. In fact, he wrote in his journal this word. He said, "After my exploration, I find no reason to make a single change in the text of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. After further study of the life of Jesus, he said, I have seen the Nazarene. I saw his works. I was at his crucifixion through my study. I watched and studied him like the character in my book for years. And when I was finished, I said, God only is great. And I became a believer." He wrote 7 books. But the book he was most famous for, Lew Wallace, was about his journey to investigate these claims. The book is called Ben-Hur. And Ben-Hur was a character he developed that was really himself, investigating the Bible, investigating the claims of Christ, and coming to the point that Lew Wallace came to, which is if all that factual prediction is true, and if all the evidence in the New Testament is true, then I'm going to give God my life, and I'm going to trust him to be my forgiver and to be my leader. Maybe you'd like to respond in the same way that Lew Wallace did and say, I need to investigate, I want to trust you, and I want to acknowledge my belief. I just want to give us a chance to do that. Let's close in prayer here this morning. And